Welcome to Art-splanations, the podcast that is for non-artists, artists, and everyone in between.
Each week, we ask a different search engine a question related to art, and then we talk about it. Welcome back. I'm Andrew Malcheski, and with me is
Joanna Bolsons.
And today, we're going to be talking about the artist Yayoi Kusama.
You might know Yayoi Kusama because of her infinity rooms. They're wildly popular, shown all around the world. I'm sure if you haven't Instagrammed a picture of yourself in one, you've seen somebody who has. They're really beautiful. They're small rooms that once you step inside, just feels like infinite space and light. All four walls are a mirror, and she has these beautiful, soft, yellow, kind of orangey, glowing lights or pumpkins, depending on what room you find. And they just seem to go on forever. They're really beautiful and really, really calming, in my opinion, and just wildly popular at this time.
Yeah, I don't know about calming so much. Whenever I go to them, they have like a charged atmosphere to the space. Because your time in there is limited, so you don't really have time to look at any of the way that it's made or how it's constructed. You're literally just enveloped in this complete obliteration of the natural space. But it's a very small room, and like that kind of like the whole experience of waiting in line and going into this room and only having 40 seconds to experience, and then knowing that you only have this limited amount of time, I think charges it with this kind of energy.
I didn't think of that. I found it just calm, because once you step in, it's almost like you're floating, because you walk in on this, you have a narrow strip that you can step on, and it's like I said, it's like you're floating, and the soft glow of the lights that she chose to install in her work, it's warm but not overbearing, if that makes sense. I don't know. I felt very calm in it and relaxed. Even in the short time span, it feels sad whenever they open the door, because you only have such a short time in there. But I found it really relaxing.
Yeah, it's one of those things you have to experience. You can't look at it in a video or a photograph and really get the full effect.
Yeah.
Which is really interesting.
And if you're lucky, the first time we went, we waited in line for what? An hour?
Yeah.
And again, it's only 40 seconds or 45 seconds. It's under a minute for sure that you're allowed in there. But this last time, we were able to schedule on a weekday, and we scheduled it early in the morning. You have your time slot. I think ours was like at 10 or 10:30, and we were the only ones there. So we showed up at our allotted time, did it, and as we're walking around looking at other works, the attendant asked if we wanted to go back inside because nobody else was there. So maybe try to schedule it like that, and you might get lucky with a really cool attendant like we were.
Yeah, it's nice because, like I said, the shortness of time that you get to experience is definitely part of the piece. It's a well thought out, choreographed thing, and like I think that if you could just like go in and spend an hour or even 5 minutes, it would be too much time. You would start to pick out like the seams in the space and see all kind of start to see how it's put together instead of just experiencing it for what it is,
instead of just enjoying the finite moment.
Yeah,
because when you compare it to like Terrells are meant to last for
an hour,
if not more.
Yeah, and his is like you lose yourself in the space because your body is super saturated with one color or a way that color works, and so there's a psychological effect because of that.
Yeah, his is more how color affects you and nature in that aspect, whereas Kusama is more about repetition. And you can see that in the infinity rooms because it's those dots, and then that same room is then repeated infinitely in the reflections of the mirror.
Yeah, and obliteration is something that she's talked about, and it's like is part of why she makes her work. She talks about, if you read some of the articles on her, there's a really good documentary on her where she talks about hallucinating as a young girl and her entire field of vision just being obliterated by these like dots or these nets, and she recreates that in her work so that you, the viewer, then experience this traumatic thing that happened to her.
That's a good segue. So, just to talk about who she is and how she came to be, Yayoi Kusama. She was from Japan. She grew up in a really tumultuous family. Like you said, she's had hallucinations since she was a young child, and she witnessed some pretty horrific things in her childhood. Again, that great documentary is on Hulu if you want to check it out. It goes into great detail of what she experienced as a child and what's influenced her. But I believe it was in her early 20s. She had tried to be an artist in Japan, and they kind of accepted some of her works. I know her watercolors were...
She was shown... She had several exhibitions in Japan, as well as several solo exhibitions in Tokyo, which led her to meet a doctor there who helped her get a visa to come to America to exhibit.
Oh, okay.
Because her family didn't want her to. So against the wishes of her family, that doctor helped her get a visa.
She had to convince her family to send her to art school, even.
Yeah.
At some point as a child. She's been a wonderful artist all her life, but she's always had to kind of fight for what she's wanted to do. I know she had a bunch of really pretty watercolors while she was in Japan, but once she came to America and she was in New York, that's really when she kind of dove deep into this otherworldly kind of work. That's in New York, that's where she hooked up with like Klaus Oldenburg and Warhol and
Donald Judd.
Yeah, and started hanging out in the factory and really became part of that kind of pop art movement.
Well, that's because she was a student at the Artist Student League, where all of those artists were students. And she was also showing work in galleries in New York where they were also all showing work in the same space.
Well, she really, again, had to fight for that. She had to beg for galleries to show her work, and a lot of them didn't. Or they would throw her in as like the token female or token immigrant. And she would play up the role as immigrant. She would wear a kimono, walking around New York and filming herself. She would call those happenings, art happenings or something. But she was accepted, but she felt more like a token.
I mean, I wonder how much she was really... Yeah, she did have to fight for it. I'm not saying that she wasn't, but she was widely exhibited. She had exhibitions in New York and internationally. And yeah, any female artist, any artist of color in that era was marginalized by the white male-dominated art world and the gallerists and the galleries that represented them. But she was still a very successful and widely shown artist who, I mean, if you look at her biography and her exhibition record, it is incredible. The stuff that she's done is very formidable. I mean, she helped produce a music video for Peter Gabriel at one point.
It's incredible, but also, like, she's had to scrap her away. She had to do a lot of stuff that her contemporaries didn't have to do because she was an immigrant, because she was female. And it's been shown that Klaus Oldenburg, who has been credited with the idea of self-sculpture, stole that idea from Yayoi Kusama.
Yeah, I mean, Warhol straight up ripped off
her repetition
and like that, covering a wall with an image. And so did there's another guy who, like, 4 months after her first Infinity Room, basically did the exact same thing.
And that's what I mean. Like, yeah, her CV is incredible, but it's not until now that she's getting that recognition that Warhol has had for the past 50 years, that Oldenburg has had for the past 50 years.
True. But she did, like, I feel like it's hard to, I'll try and say, I feel like there's an air of like that she's just some unknown artist who suddenly appeared in the last 10 or 15 years because she was shunned by the art world or was barely exhibiting throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But the reality is she did go to Art Students League and she was showing and she was close friends with several very well-known artists like Georgia O'Keeffe and Barbara Hemsworth. And so, like, it's not that she didn't have to fight those fights, but she was also, I mean, she is, by anybody's standard, a incredibly successful and prolific artist. Throughout the majority of her life, she's been that way.
Okay, and you're absolutely correct, but she wasn't getting that kind of name dropping that Warhol was getting. You know, she wasn't getting credit of the time.
Right.
And I think some of it was because she has a mental condition, and so she kind of would get psychotic at some points. She really had a hard time navigating social situations. So she might have put off a lot of gallery directors or other artists, which might have affected how they wanted to represent her. But at the same time, if you're willing to put up with some of the other male artists who are just as bad and just as depressed, why wouldn't you do the same for her? Like, if you're going to revere Van Gogh for an attempted suicide, why wouldn't you revere Kusama for an attempted suicide in her time as well?
I mean, it's the 1960s. She's a woman. She's a woman of color. We know why.
I know.
Like, it's, I mean, the answer to that question is...
I just want to argue it now so that fellow female artists now can start to call stuff out as it's happening so that hopefully we can make a change.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm not trying to lessen that by any extent, but I just want to make sure that, you know, if you look at her work record, it is vast.
Well, and I think that's a credit to her work ethic. She never took no for an answer. She didn't take stuff lying down. She saw when people were stealing her stuff, and she would call them out, and she would try to make something better. Like, she used it as a way to push herself. So she didn't take things lying down, and I think that's, again, why her CV is so vast. She didn't just go sit in her room and cry.
I mean, she, after each time that her work was stolen, she literally locked herself in her room for months on end.
But what was she doing in her room? Sketching.
Was she?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't read anything about what she did. It just said that she locked herself in a room.
Well, again, so did Van Gogh.
Yeah.
Didn't Gauguin flee the country at one point with his mistress?
I mean, I think that had more to do with him abandoning his family than people stealing his work.
Okay, but the argument is he's just as much of a... Or not just as much. The argument is he's a terrible person, but his work is good enough to overshadow that? No. So she has a mental breakdown and locks herself in her room because somebody stole her work. That's a valid way to process that. So even if she wasn't sketching or doing work, she was processing what's happened to her and somebody stole her idea. Even if she didn't do any work, okay, she's depressed about it. But she did get over it, and she did keep pushing.
Okay.
I feel like this is getting heated.
I'm just pointing out biographical facts of her life.
All right. I feel like we're focusing too much on her as a female and how she's going to push herself working. Let's talk about the actual work. So her soft sculptures, they are, again, repetitious. She does these...
Penises? Let's call them what they are.
They're phallic in nature.
I'm pretty sure they are supposed to literally be flaccid penises.
So yeah, they are absolutely penises. There's a phallic protrusion covered boat, which is a very PC way of saying it's a boat with a bunch of penises.
I mean, it's not like they're dildos. They are soft sculptural representations of a flaccid penis.
Yeah, they almost look like sea anemones.
Yeah.
And it's called a Aggregation 1000 Boat Show. She did this one in the 60s. And one of the things she experienced as a child that's continuously been brought up in her work is she had seen her father having an affair, and that heavily messed with her way to relate to sexual intercourse with anybody, with a lover, with, seeing it happen in movies or whatever. So it's come up in her work, and that specific boat, I think there's a photo of her lying nude on it, and it's her way of kind of coming to terms with the male organ, and as a female, it always being present in pretty much everything. We're constantly bombarded with that sexual imagery, and then she wanted to make the male viewer uncomfortable with all of these penises covering her work. She also did like a chair and like it was like a beanbag kind of shape with all these phallic shapes on it growing off of it. She wanted to make the male viewer as uncomfortable as the female is in a male-dominated society.
Yeah.
And again, in the 60s, when women are trying to, assert their rights in getting a job and having a bank account, because women couldn't have a bank account without their husband's or father's approval at this time. She's trying to push this gender equality in her work.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me a lot of someone trying to flip that idea of the male gaze, which was...
It's almost Cindy Sherman-esque.
Yeah, that's the artist I was trying to think of. Which, I mean, is also very interesting that, reversal of the viewer role. Because, I mean, everything at that point, it was all being made by white male artists for white male collectors, pretty much. I mean, that was the...
Or, as we've already said, it was the white male artist stealing ideas of others and presenting it to white male collectors.
Right, but like that was the gender normative way that things were done. Everything was, I mean, not made for those colors, but that was just how everything was focused. All your advertisement was girls in bikinis and guys in suits, right? Like it was all male gaze, and her actually like working against that and also using her own uncomfortableness with sex and intercourse as like a way to shift that viewership so that then the male is uncomfortable, much how the female is. I didn't even thought about that in those works. I thought they were just a reference to that initial trauma she had been trying to work through.
And I think any woman can relate to those rooms as well. Her first mirror room installation was called Phallus Field, again in the 60s. And it's just these phallus-shaped soft sculptures covered in red polka dots. So there's the repetition that we see in everything. And you stand in this room covered with penises, and it just goes on forever. And again, as a female, we're highly aware of any male that we don't know that's close to our vicinity, because we're taught yell fire instead of rape if you're getting attacked, because nobody cares if you're actually getting raped, but a fire somebody might answer to. So just that hyper, what was the word you said earlier about the infinity rooms? You said it was like charged energy.
Yeah.
In that room, I would feel a charged energy because you're surrounded by this aggressive shape with that connotation.
Yeah. I mean, as a white male, those are not things I think of when I view stuff, and so it's interesting to get a different perspective on it.
Well, there's a great, to go off on a little tangent, there's that great John Mulaney bit where he's rushing to the train, and there's a girl like 10 feet in front of him. She starts rushing faster. So he thinks, oh, she hears that the train's already here.
Yeah.
So they both start running, and then he realizes she's running away from me, but I was just trying to get to the train. Like, you don't think of those things,
right.
Again, because you're a white male.
Yeah.
But to get back to Yayoi, another one of her pieces that I absolutely love, she kind of crashed the Venice Biennale. It was in 1966. And she got permission to be on the grounds. She wasn't one of the official invitees, but she got permission to do this installation on the grounds. So she had all these mirrored balls.
1,500.
Yeah. And she's standing in her kimono, really dressed as the traditional Japanese female, kind of invoking this idea of a stranger from a strange foreign land, pushing the idea that I'm different. And she was hawking these balls for $2 to all of these patrons. And eventually people were complaining that it was more of a peddler instead of this highbrow art that they were trying to showcase at the Venice Biennale. So they removed her, but they left her installation. They said, your installation can stay, but you can't be peddling these balls for $2. But she was really kind of playing with that idea of we all think we're important, especially since at this time she was a counterpart of Warhol, who was kind of elevating the pop stars and the celebrity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's got these mirror balls, and when you look down at it, you just see your own reflection, hence the title, Narcissus Garden. So she's kind of, it's a tongue-in-cheek making fun of the viewer.
A little bit. She's also playing the role of Narcissus from the Ovid. Because Narcissus' hand, what comes up out of the pool, and her lover sees himself and falls deeply in love with himself.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I forget the exact story. But yeah, kind of playing with, off of that, plus with the titling, and these mirrored balls where she hands it to the viewer and they see themselves and fall in love with themselves in this reflection.
And the idea of this hollowed event, hollowed ground of the Venice Biennale.
Yeah.
All these patrons spend millions and millions of dollars. Here's this thing for $2.
Yeah.
It's like Felix Gonzalez, and you're giving this candy away to the patrons for free. She's hawking this for pennies in comparison. Which I just love.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, she went on to put that work, she installed it in multiple different places. And in each installation, she wasn't part of it after that. So I know that there was one a bit later where they were just floating on open water. And then she had another one where it was in an abandoned warehouse with graffiti in the background. But the connotation of that work as it changes from the Biennale to these other areas is always an interesting thing about work that is site specific, or not site specific, but installed to a space, how that space changes the connotations of the work and the way that you view it.
It also makes me want to question, when did Warhol start using silver? Because she's using it as a mirror. He started doing those events where he would let off those silver balloons into the city, and he would cover his factory in aluminum foil, and he would
Right.
talk about the reflection and how aluminum foil is used behind mirrors. And I'm wondering if this was a talk that they had. I'd love to sit in on a conversation between the two.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like, it's silver. It's like red. You can't say, well, I was using red first. 'Cause you know
I'm
what?
not saying that, yeah.
You were, and like the way that Warhol was using it, it's very different from the way that Yayoi was.
But knowing that they ran in the same circles, I would
Yeah.
like to hear the conversation.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I thought you were saying that you thought maybe Warhol had shoinked,
I had
The-
stolen that idea too.
which is like saying like, oh, you stole the idea of the viewer seeing themselves in a reflection.
No,
that
no.
is an
And in all honesty,
old idea.
In all honesty, his stealing the idea of repetition, he stole like an artist. I'm okay with that. Klaus Oldenburg, on the other hand, though, he was doing sculpture in like paper mache.
Yeah,
And then all of a
4 months
sudden,
later,
yeah, all of a sudden he sees this woman using fabric. And textile is traditionally used by women and viewed as a craft, not a fine art. Same way with embroidery. He sees this and, again, 4 months later, steals that idea. That I have a problem with. I think Warhol stole like an artist and like an artist should. He took it and he made it his own.
yeah. And I mean, the connotations the way Warhol did it was also slightly different from the way that Yayoi did it,
Right.
which is fine. And I mean, the other thing is like Oldenburg said like, oh no, my work is so much better. I forget what quote he had, but he didn't even attribute it to her. Of course, Warhol didn't either. He attributed it to a conversation he had with Collector, I think.
Which, and maybe he had both.
Yeah.
You know, he had a lot of stuff going on around him, but the fact that Oldenburg just denied any kind of influence, that's BS.
Yeah, the other artist who blatantly stole the mirrored infinity rooms was Samaras. Before he had done work in mirrors, we never made it an environment out of them. And she had her first one, and I think it was 4 or 6 months later, he did this mirrored room. And I remember at community college, in art history, talking about Samaras' work, and there was not one peep of Yayoi Kusama. And like his work was in,
that's frustrating.
yeah, and his work was in the art history book, and she wasn't. And so, like when you talk about her not getting, just not getting rightful attribution, that is frustrating because then you hear about, oh, she did it literally 4 to 6 months before him.
Yeah.
And yeah, his work, he didn't just like blatantly copy what she did, but the concept clearly came from her. Like he clearly saw that and was very much influenced, and he should, it should say he did this. He was influenced by this other artist who was doing work at the same time, who was one of her contemporaries.
Well, it's like Picasso. They credit him with Cubism. They never talk about his roommate, who was also doing Cubism, who actually came up with the idea, but because of his PTSD from World War I, he killed himself. So Picasso was then the only person doing it. So he was credited with it.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the frustrating things with the art world, is if you can get, the gallery or the, whoever at that kind of upper echelon level of art making to certify you as the person or to push you out there, it's kind of a snowball effect. Once you get to a certain point, you kind of take on steam, and then your work just kind of snowballs downhill from there, where you are now this like preeminent person, and whether someone came before or after you, you still have that preeminence.
Right.
And unfortunately, in the 60s, it was white men, like, given that preeminence specifically.
Yeah. So, in saying that, I am quite happy for her, though, because since then, she did have, like, a breakdown, I know she had one suicide attempt. I think there was a second. But she kind of came to realize she can still make the work she wants to make, but she obviously needs help. So she went back to Japan, and at this point they had rejected her.
She went back to Japan. She hadn't been rejected per se, 'cause she was still being shown.
She was still being shown somewhat, but they didn't like who she was as a person.
She was putting on happenings.
She was putting on happenings.
She was nude. And she did get arrested in Tokyo. I think it was Tokyo or Kyoto for doing one of these happenings where she was nude.
Right. And I think she performed, supposedly, I couldn't confirm this, she supposedly performed the first gay marriage in the United States. She's always advocated for gay rights. But again, that's besides the point. She wasn't openly embraced when she went back home.
Right.
As a person. They might have been okay with some of her work, but they didn't openly embrace her. But she realized, I need to get my life in order. Like, I'm not going to be able to live as long as I possibly could if I keep having this mental instability. So she went home, where she still lives today, and she's been able to live at a mental facility, but she gets to leave during the day to her studio where she has some help, and she obviously has found a great balance where she has a little nurse that goes with her, and she has some studio hands, and she's able to do her work all day, every day. So I think that's not only a great story to somebody who was not given the right credit when she should have been. Yeah. So that now she can start to get it at, I think, 92.
Well, she started seeing she got professional help when she was still in the States, because I think Georgia O'Keeffe's dealer talked to her dealer and had her dealer suggest that she go seek mental help, and she did. And that started it.
That snowballed it.
Yeah, and so from there, and I know when she moved back to Japan, I think her dad died, and that's why she ended up staying in Japan, because originally, from what I read, she was only supposed to be there for like 3 months.
To get that mental help.
I don't think it was to get mental help. I think she was returning. I think she had full citizenship in the United States or a full-time visa. And she had returned, I think, for an exhibition or something, or just to return home. It was supposed to be a short stay.
Well, either way, though, I'm just happy. The main thing that I took away from what I've read and that documentary was that she finally got the help, and she seemed to have the balance in her life that she needed to continue making work that is prolific. Yeah. And she's able to have that stability, because that was one thing. Like you said earlier, she would lock herself away, or she would lash out at some people that I read. So now she's able to kind of have that great home-work balance.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's one of the things you can definitely take away from looking at her. She was almost manic in her production, where she would produce a lot of work to a point where it's, you could argue that it probably wasn't the most healthy way
which is
to work.
Honestly, it's this weird kind of initiation into the art world. Like, oh, I stayed up till 4 a.m. working on this. Yeah. Oh yeah, man, I haven't slept in 3 days. Like, it's this weird kind of acceptance that is completely unhealthy. Yeah. And it shouldn't be accepted. Yeah. But I know in college and in my early 20s, I was part of that. I pushed my friends, I pushed myself to stay up all night.
Pulling all-nighters in the studio. In undergrad, we did that. We'd stay up all night till 3, 4 in the morning, drawing and working on art manically, and
it's not healthy.
No.
And even professors will push that too. Like, oh, I didn't eat today, I've been working on this woodcut, or oh, I've been up all night chain smoking and working on this oil painting. Professors even today will push that, and I don't know if it's because of the capitalism that is so ingrained in the art world, or if it's just that kind of old artist life that has been so romanticized. So seeing her find that balance that we've strived for is really encouraging, and it leaves me with hope.
Yeah, and I mean, I think one of the reasons why it's kind of still prolific is part of it is that old tradition of, you kind of have publish or perish. You have to produce. You have to produce a lot of work. Because guess what? If you produce a lot of work, some of them aren't going to be bad. Some of them will be good. And by just making lots of work, you're going to get better. And then you can kind of sift through the garbage and find the gems and then make more gems.
But there's a line between making a lot of work and working nonstop to where your brain and your body can't rest.
Right. And that's unhealthy. But I think also part of it is that, we now live in an era of a saturated market where everybody can just go on and make an Etsy store, put a website up, make a podcast. I mean, and so there's a lot more stuff out there where the gatekeepers of the gallery are no longer the only people with keys to the kingdom. And if you don't, if you're not putting up a drawing a day on Instagram or something like that, you're kind
or
of
an NFT a day, like what's his face?
But if you're not doing something where you're prolifically out there, you are relegating yourself to obscurity. And if even in obscurity, the chances of you getting the next job that's going to move you forward in your career, getting work into a gallery, it's harder. By having a website filled with work, by having an Instagram that's just constantly doing stuff, people look at that stuff, your social medias, before they hire you. They look at you before they, give you a position in their gallery because they know, oh, he's got 26,000 followers. Yeah, I'm going to put his work in my gallery over the guy with 5,000 because he's going to post about it, and now my gallery gets 26,000 views. And that
Which is so sad, though, because what if the 5,000 guy, what if their work is so much better?
But a gallery's a business. And it's one of those things where we've
it's one of
talked
those
about
frustrating
before.
Things. Let's put an adjective in there.
Yeah,
it's one
it
of
is
those frustrating things that is unnecessary.
And I think it's why you see a proliferation of work that is sometimes substandard. Because if you have a good social media presence, your work doesn't have to maybe be the best to get recognition.
Yeah. Which, this is a great intro. Kusama actually has work that you can buy. I found her store online. There's obviously some that are like $22,000, which is extremely out of our price range.
Yeah.
But there are some of her pumpkins, because pumpkins are very prolific in her work, much like the polka dots, that were relatively cheap in comparison. The cheap one I found was $800, which for us is still a lot of money, but in comparison to her other works, that's like clearance priced.
Yeah, and that's only like, hey, if I had $800 of disposable income, I'd buy one.
I would totally buy a Kusama.
Yeah. I mean, I get that it's probably a slipcast mass-produced item that she is maybe
hand painting the dots.
Maybe hand painting a dot.
Maybe.
Or maybe just
signed her name at the bottom.
Or talk to the person who is doing it at one point. But once again, if it's agreed that it's a Kusama, it's a Kusama.
If she signed the provenance papers, then I'll totally get it.
Yeah.
But really, I just wanted to talk about, this was more of, hey, what episode do you want to do? I want to talk about Yayoi. Because I feel an intrinsic connection to her as a female, as somebody who gets severely depressed and will lock themselves away. I am very happy that somebody has found the success she has had in her lifetime, because so many times you hear about the artist didn't get famous until afterwards. And it's not about the fame or the money, it's just about that acceptance.
Yeah.
So that's really why I wanted to talk about her, because she finally, after so much BS in her life, has finally found the recognition that she deserves. And fun fact, she is the top-selling female artist in the world right now.
Living female artist.
Top-selling living female artist in the world right now, which is saying a lot because, again, women are completely underrepresented in any museum or gallery. Women of color are absolutely even less represented.
Yeah.
And the fact that she's living so that she can see this just is icing on the cake.
Yeah, and that's another thing that we should definitely say is If you're interested in more artists like Yayoi Kusama, you should look into the other art history, the art history of the other, and actually see some of these underrepresented people of color, women artists throughout history who, because of their race or their sex or, their whatever it is, because they weren't white men, basically, they didn't get the recognition for what they were doing.
Yeah, don't rely solely on Jansen's history of art.
Yeah. Western textbooks on art history, they are starting to get a little bit better, but starting doesn't mean that
it's a complete set. Yeah. Like, really take everything with a grain of salt.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the world we live in, where just because you read it on the internet or it came from a textbook doesn't necessarily mean...
Consider who the author is. If you have a chance to go see one of her infinity rooms, please do so. There's short little spurts of time, but they are so worth it.
Yeah, waiting in line an hour to spend 40 seconds in a room doesn't sound worth it, but the experience is absolutely worth it.
Yeah. And
don't just go in there with your camera out and take a bunch of pictures. Go in there and experience it. Actually spend some time, looking around, reflecting on the space, and
listen to how quiet it is in there.
So if you have a chance, check out that documentary on Yayoi Kusama. It's called Kusama Infinity. It is very informative and gives you a brief overview of her life and some of the struggles she had as a young female artist of color in the 1960s. There are some Kusama works that are my favorite that we didn't even touch on, and those are her Infinite Net paintings.
Oh, the paintings.
Some of her early works, they are probably my favorite pieces by her.
More than the rooms?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Drawings or paintings, depending on how you want to call them, where she does just little circles across the canvas, and she varies the pressure and tone of the circles and the size to create this kind of undulating effect. Mm-hmm. And pretty sure they're all monochrome, so they're white or shades of red or yellow. And it's these, she calls them infinity nets.
And again, it's that soft kind of red or that soft kind of yellow. It's very calming.
And it just like the black negative space, because it's usually color on a black field, but because it's completely covering it with the color, the black ends up being these tiny little specks that create this undulating form on the canvas that is really interesting to look at.
It's funny you mentioned that. I found this great quote from her that says, "A polka dot has the form of the sun, which is a symbol of the energy of the whole world and our living life, and also the form of the moon, which is calm, round, soft, colorful, senseless, and unknowing. Polka dots are a way to infinity." Which I just think is beautiful. And considering that she probably uses her own artwork as art therapy.
Yeah.
So that kind of, let me just zone out and do all of these polka dots for hours on end, probably gives her some sense of stability.
And catharsis, I'm sure.
Yeah. That's our episode on Yayoi Kusama. If you've been fortunate enough to be in one of her infinity rooms, let us know your experience and how you felt inside of it. What were your emotions? Because I would love to hear everybody's different perspective of it. And if you have a favorite work of hers that we didn't cover, let us know. And maybe we don't know that it exists, and we would love to look it up as well.
I'm Andrew Malcheski.
And I'm, as always, Joanna Bolsons.
And hopefully you're still you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. It means so much that you would take the time to listen to us. If you like what you hear and would like to help us out, please give us a review and like on your podcast app and iTunes. Comment and tell your friends and family. We would also like to thank the Joy Drops and Free Music Archive for our music.
We want to have a conversation. This means that any research we do for a subject is often done a week or two before we record, and our notes are minimal. This also means that as we talk about things, we might make mistakes, like in the pronunciation of names or the misattribution of a statement or a piece of work, and the messing up with titles and dates. If we do and we notice, we'll put a correction in the show notes. And if we don't, let us know so that we can.
The best place to contact us is on our website, www.art-splanations.com. There you can find out more about us, the show, and each episode.
You'll be able to find every artist quote and most of the specific vocabulary we use in each episode, as well as a list of upcoming topics.
We invite you to join the conversation, so please let us know what you think. If you have suggestions or topics for discussion, you can let us know at our website, www.art-splanations.com.
If you are curious about our artwork, the best place to find is on our Instagrams. I'm at Andrew Malczewski, that's at AndrewMalczewski.
And I'm at joanna.bolsons.artist. That's JOANNA.BOLSINS.ARTIST.
These links and others can be found on the Art-splanation website. That's www.art-splanations.com, www.artsplanation.com.